You're listening to Three Kitchens Podcast, hosted by Erin Walker and Heather Dyer. Tune in weekly to get inspired and make good food.
Are you ready to nerd out with me on corn?
I sure am.
All right. Hello and welcome to Three Kitchens Podcast. I'm Erin Walker and I'm here with Heather Dyer. And in today's episode, I'm talking corn.
Corn. I'm pushing up my glasses with my finger. I'm getting ready to nerd
Excellent.
out about corn.
I hope people aren't disappointed now and they're like, that's not that nerdy.
Hey, no judgment here at Three Kitchens. You can be as much or as little of a nerd as you want and still be a nerd, okay?
Thank you.
Yep.
So I've got this killer crop of corn in my garden right now on the side of my house. We've had corn before, but it hasn't ever done this well. And I'm just in love with my little forest of corn.
It is quite impressive. It's tall and the cobs are big. People might be listening from places and be like, yeah, so what? You're growing corn. Like anybody can grow corn, but not here. Not in our backyards. Typically, I think the zone we're in is a little cold for it.
We're a little bit cooler. We're a little bit drier. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they need lots of light and sun. And often we just don't get the right conditions to grow corn in an urban garden. And the space to do it too, because they need each other to pollinate.
Oh, okay. So we're hitting the nerdy stuff already.
We're getting right into it here. So corn is really cool for me. It's one of those things that is not like any other plants, or it's not very closely related to any other crops that we find that just occur on their own. It's been highly specified for human use because it was modified so many years ago. How many years ago did corn start appearing in our records, guys?
How many, Erin?
About 9,000 years ago.
Wow.
That's cool.
Was it a vastly different plant then at that point?
It was, Heather.
Yeah.
It was.
The look on your face. I'm enjoying this so much.
There is a wild plant called Teosinte. I'm saying it a few times so that I get the right one.
Okay.
And it is a short little plant. It's got about 5 or 6 hard-coated kernels on it.
Oh.
And this is what they thought, hey, I want to turn this into corn. So it's this really tiny little grass-related plant.
Oh.
And corn that we see now is its closest relative. It took a long time for them to really even determine what the original plant was that they started modifying and selecting from, because it is so wildly different now from what it was. And so what I could find for research, they said that this occurred in the central Balsas Valley in southwestern Mexico, where they started selectively breeding corn to have longer cobs, to have more kernels, and to have not this hard coating on the kernels.
So the original plant, those were the plant seeds, I'm assuming, to drop in the soil, or do they know anything about other critters eating it or anything like that? Like,
good question.
Too hard for our teeth. Maybe a bird.
Maybe a bird. I'm not sure how they would have spread, but that does take us on to the discussion around corn structure.
Okay.
Each one of those little kernels of corn that is on the cob is the seed. So each of those is a corn seed. And attached to each of those corn seeds is one of those long silks. So you know when you've got that fresh cob of corn, you've got that hairy, silky stuff that you have to pull off and take out. Those are all, each one of those, there's one for every kernel of corn on there.
Oh.
And that is the female part of the plant that needs to get pollinated. So that's why those tassels grow out and they're kind of sticky when they're new and green, because they want pollen.
Okay.
That pollen comes from the top of the corn plant. The top is the tassel.
Oh, okay.
So on the very top of the plant is the
Yeah.
tassel. The corns kind of grow out of the armpit of the corn leaves or the shoulder. They've got this little, yep.
It's sounding delicious. You're eating the armpit of the plant. It's hairy armpit.
Plant, it's got hair.
I like the hairy armpit of the corn.
There you
stalk.
go.
Mm-hmm.
Most corn plants need other corn plants around in order for pollination to occur thoroughly. On your cob of corn, if you're growing it and you only get like 5 kernels and they're all weird and kind of strange, you haven't had complete pollination. Or, you know, sometimes you open a cob of corn and it's like half of them didn't ever develop. That's a pollination problem.
That makes sense.
This corn, as we know it today, started to spread throughout the Americas. Around 6,000 years ago, it started moving down to be a more cultivated crop in South America. Around 4,500 years ago, it spread up into the United States and it started being used by indigenous people there. And it did not make its way across the pond until good old Columbus got some seeds when he came over in the late 1400s.
Okay.
And that's when he brought it back into Spain. At that point, the Spanish Empire was pretty big, and corn started to move throughout all of those places, and they started to grow it all over, and then it just kind of exploded.
Because it could have been on ships and on over land and just...
Oh, and it grows fairly easily. It produces a much more nutrient-dense crop than like wheat or any other grain that you grow. And so by the 18th century, it started becoming like the poor man's staple food in Italy. And that's when we start seeing things like polenta rise up in popularity and all that kind of corn-based food that we now associate with different cultures worldwide. So it's kind of cool. It's this thing that started so long ago. They started doing this modification, which is really neat because the theories of how you select for different plants to have different traits by just breeding ones that have the traits that you like, that sort of thinking didn't come along until much later in Europe, whereas people in Southwest Mexico who were doing this with the corn plants were doing that exact same thing.
Yeah.
Really intensely doing this and really changing this grain from something it was to something completely new and different. I think it's a really cool process.
We tend to think that that many years ago, people were not evolved enough or like weren't focused on this. They were surviving. They weren't thinking about, I don't know how to describe it, but like you just think they're so focused on just day-to-day survival that you eat what you can find that's edible, not, here's this thing that's not quite edible, but maybe it could be, and what could we do with it? And like actually this whole sort of industry was happening that you don't typically imagine happened, right?
Yeah, and I feel like this is not like, I don't think this is 100% factual, but I don't think there's many other food crops that we eat that we have influenced so intensely. Corn is like, nothing else is like it. I always go off on this tangent with corn because I think it is so cool.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible.
It's a huge consumed crop that kind of started from one little place where they did all this intense change and modification and then
can you imagine you're that early person and you're looking at this thing and you're like we're talking to each other and we're like and you say to me, I think we could do something with this plant to make it edible, and I'd be like, oh, okay, well, what do you think it's going to taste like?
I'm sure they could open it up and taste it. I'm sure there were ways to go after it.
If you smell the green parts, like that husk that's over it smells like corn. Like there's no mistaking what that is, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it was something like, this smells good. Well, how do you know it's going to be edible? Well, I don't know, but let's try. Like you can just imagine these people having these conversations and I don't know. It's fascinating.
What did they think of the guy who is like, oh, I'm going to make this better? And people are like,
It's like the thing my kids will often say things like that. Can you imagine? Like, who was the first person who thought, let's try eating that?
Yeah.
People are tenacious. They're just going to keep going and keep trying. And we've loved food since the dawn of man.
Exactly. So corn is growing at my house. Corn is super cool. I'm going to make some corn food.
Okay. What is it?
I'm torn on this. I'm torn on my corn decision.
Do you need me to weigh in, help you?
I might just make it all, which seems like a reasonable. See, Heather's like peeked up. She's like,
I'm
yes,
like, oh, more
please do make
food.
it all.
Yes.
Because I find it really interesting how corn ended up as this, the poor man's staple in Italy. And polenta is this really big Italian food, and I found this delicious recipe that has a red pepper salsa on the side that you kind of eat with it. Like, it sounds like a great warm dinner table corn. Do you eat polenta?
I have eaten it, but I've never made it.
But I've never made it myself. Yeah. So I'd like to make this, and this is more of a solid one where you make the polenta, you put it in a pan, you let it sit and solidify, and then you slice it up, pan fry it, and then serve it with this sauce. And it sounds great. The only thing is it takes cornmeal, not fresh corn.
I know. I was waiting to hear how you're going to make cornmeal.
So I think I'm going to make this anyway because I have cornmeal. I like this idea. But I also came across a recipe for something called sweet corn mochi.
Mochi is a dessert.
It's a Japanese dessert. Sweet corn mochi cake. It's got fresh corn, coconut milk, glutinous rice flour, eggs, sugar, butter, vanilla, salt, and baking powder. And so you mix together this batter, you pop it in a dish, and then you bake it. And it makes this really interesting looking cake that just
it looks kind of so soft, spongy, sort of.
It looks like a soft, like gelatinous kind of cake,
which I'm not surprised by. Yeah,
it almost makes me think of that Chinese New Year cake you made, but softer
for sure,
softer and spongier.
This looks like you could pull it apart, like more like a cake, I guess.
I think both the textures are very gummy like.
Yeah.
So,
but softer than the Chinese New Year cake.
But softer, yeah. Anyway, I look at that and I'm like, that makes me really curious. Because this makes use of the corn next to my house, I think I'm going to do both. And this also makes me think of that sweet corn drink that we drank when we were guests on Lena and Avery's podcast, Mess Hall. It was like a juice box.
But it was corn. You know what? We liked that.
I didn't mind it.
It sounds disgusting, but we actually quite enjoyed.
Well, that's why I saw this. And I was like, well, now I want sweet corn mochi cake because I like sweet corn juice boxes.
Yeah. Who knew? It was so weird, but it was so good.
So I think I'm going to try a few things with corn here. I think this is where we're going to go. I can't pick just one.
I'm looking forward to both of these because they sound like they'll be very different. One of them I'm familiar with, the other not. So I'm very excited.
Something sweet, something savory, and all of it potentially gluten-free. How often do we come across a gluten-free dessert?
That's true. Unless it's been modified to be gluten-free.
Unless it's been modified. Yeah. Exactly. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a really cool gluten-free dessert.
I am very curious. Go shuck some corn, Erin. Go shuck your corn.
I'm gonna go climb into the cornfield. You might not see me for a while.
Don't get lost.
Hey listeners, I hope you're enjoying this fun episode. Did you know you can find this recipe on our website? We post all the recipes for each episode on threekitchenspodcast.com, and we even include recipes that we're not making for the podcast, just things we make every day in our kitchen. Leave a comment, tell us what you like about the recipe, or what you don't like, or how you zhuzhed it up. You can find the link in our show notes, or type it in, threekitchenspodcast.com. All right, I'm back from my corn harvest and corn cooking, and I'm all corned out.
Are you? Are you done with corn now?
I'm done with corn now. I made some fried polenta cakes, some sweet corn mochi, and a roasted red pepper dip that went with the polenta cakes. And if you ask me, any other roasted vegetable you might want to think about putting that with?
Or just with a spoon?
Or just with a spoon.
Yep.
Then when you add these little dips and sides and stuff that sits in jars in our fridge, it always makes it 10 times better, doesn't it?
I agree.
Okay, let's talk through these fried polenta cakes.
Why not? It's the first thing I ate of what you gave me.
All right. I've always been kind of intimidated to make polenta because I've heard people talk about it and say when you're making polenta, you got to constantly be stirring it and don't let it burn to the bottom. And when you're cooking it, it's like you got to be on it. And I've heard things like it takes a long time, so your arms get tired making polenta. And I did not find this hard or intimidating to make at all. So
good.
Lucky me.
So all you naysayers. Erin
I
Walker has a
probably did this
positive
wrong.
attitude. No, no, you didn't.
It wasn't whisking mayo, so it was so much easier.
Oh, totally. See, that's why it's good that you did that type of recipe early on in the podcast. Because anytime you think, oh, something might be difficult, just think back on breaking that mayonnaise and whisking it until your arm fell off. And everything else seems so much easier.
Yep, exactly. Do something terrible at some point that makes you want to pull your face off, like when you did macarons. And then everything else is simple.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so this started out with chicken stock, and instead of heavy cream, I use sour cream because we know that dairy is not your best friend.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
And so those go into a large stock pot and a cup of water as well. And then you add in 1.5 cups of coarse ground yellow cornmeal. So I found a bag of cornmeal at the store that then had a recipe on the back for polenta and was like, this must be the right cornmeal. So that was how I went about choosing, because there are so many different types of ground dried corn products that you can buy at the store. So I would say look on the package that has, you can make polenta with this. And that would be my best advice if you want to make polenta. So you bring your liquids to a boil and then you start gradually adding in your polenta while stirring and mixing. So, it was 1.5 cups. You just got it pouring in. You're mixing this around as it's bubbling and simmering, and you keep adding it in. You've got your heat lower now and you just keep stirring and it's going to thicken up. And then you can continue to add in up to another cup of water just so that it doesn't get too thick and that everything gets kind of
like a big lump.
Ball. It's going to thicken really intensely, but they say you want it to be like a cake batter consistency in the pot. So you just kind of have to keep adding your water and your cornmeal and just kind of keep stirring. And I had this at a fairly low heat, so there was no sticking or burning to the bottom. It seemed to go pretty seamlessly. I was like, oh, good. Phew, got through this. So
it's because you're an expert.
Yeah, that's why.
Like the recipe's new to you, but standing at the stove and stirring stuff, you're an expert.
That's what I have learned to do well. I can stand and stir. All right, so once you've got this thickened, and I would say mine was definitely thicker than a cake batter when it came off the stove, and I thought, should I go back and add more water? And I was like, no, I'm just going to go with what I've got. Once my polenta thickened, you take it off the heat and you're going to add in butter and chives to this. Or you can also add Italian parsley, or you could add Parmesan cheese, which I think I'll do next time.
Yum.
This is sort of the stage where you want to fold in some flavor. And salt and pepper this at this stage too. So this is sort of where you're adding in your flavor and taste to it. And then pour or scoop, as I had to do, into a greased 9x11 baking dish. Cover it and let it cool. So you want it to harden and thicken. And it's kind of like making Rice Krispie squares is kind of what I'm akinning this to, because you melt stuff in a pot, you mix it together, you put it into a greased pan, it sets, and then you take it out and cut it into squares.
Nice.
So honestly, it was just that easy. So I did this, popped it into the fridge. The next day, I dumped it out onto my cutting board, which took a little bit of slapping and patting to get it out of my baking dish, but it was greased enough that it came out as one solid thump. Nice. And so pat it dry with a paper towel because it's going to have some moisture that's come out as it's cooled. And then you're going to heat up I use my cast iron skillet, just a thin layer of canola oil so that you can pan fry these guys up, but you want them in oil to do that. And so I cut the polenta into little squares. And then once that oil was hot enough that when I flicked water in, it sizzled. I popped the polenta cakes in there, let them cook until they were golden and crispy. You know they're ready to turn when they release off the bottom of the pan. So you have to trust, when you fry like chicken or whatever, and you got to wait until it releases.
You want to peek at it.
Kind of that little, you're kind of poking at it and it's sticking and you're like, no, it's not ready yet. Have faith. It will release, flip it over, fry it again on that side, and then remove it to a paper towel. And then I kept it in my oven in a baking dish just at 200 degrees until we served it. But you could easily make this, fry it up, and then keep it and toast it up the next day in the oven or what have you. And then this was served with what they recommended, this roasted red pepper relish. It said, or warm marinara sauce. And I was like, clicking on the roasted red pepper relish.
We don't need no marinara. Although I think marinara would also be good.
Sure, that sounds great. But honestly, you want this roasted red pepper relish. So a jar of these roasted red peppers that you can buy at the store, you want to finely chop up the red peppers, some Italian parsley, 3 tablespoons of olive oil, 2 teaspoons red wine vinegar, a couple cloves of garlic, salt, pepper, and then chili flakes if you'd like. Mixy, dippy.
Yummy.
And then you just serve that up with your polenta cakes on the side and a little spoon and just dig in and you're in heaven. I was in heaven. Were you in heaven?
Yeah, so I had them the next day. I warmed them up in my skillet.
Good idea.
Warmed up my pan, and then we just put them on until they kind of warmed up. They weren't warm all the way through, but they were. I couldn't wait any longer, so I just
I hear you.
I was digging right in, and that relish, it's kind of like a chimichurri almost. It reminded me of similar to a chimichurri, so you could also do that, would be delicious. But this was so tasty. I was like sharing, my husband, one of my kids had a little bit, and I was like, just don't eat all that. Like, give that relish back to me.
Yeah.
Do not be little piggies with it because it's mine. Oh, I loved it so much.
Yeah.
Delicious.
It was so quick and easy to make. That's going to be something that I put on the side. We had this I fried up some zucchini that night with our dinner. We just had some barbecued chicken, these polenta cakes with the dip, and then the zucchini. And then I was frying the zucchini in my pan with some oil. And I was like, what do I want to put with this? And it was like, looked at the zucchini, looked at the relish. Click, click, ding. And I tossed a tablespoon or so of this into the zucchini and fried it up with it.
Oh, yum.
Ding dong. So good. We've been eating a lot of zucchini because when you have a garden and zucchini plants and they do well, you have too much zucchini. There's no such thing as the optimal amount of zucchini. You either have none.
You can give me some. I'll take some.
Hey. Oh, watch out.
I'll take it. You could also like spoon this over, make a steak, slice it thin, spoon it over top. Really tasty and simple.
Yeah. And what did you think of the polenta in comparison to other polentas we've had? Because this was about the corn. We might as well talk about that too.
Well, I've never made polenta. I've only ever eaten it off a menu or something. So I didn't have any recent memory of polenta to compare it to.
Okay.
But I thought it was delicious. The texture was like perfect because I think it's firm. You don't want it to be like crumbly or falling apart. It's meant to be a cake. Mm-hmm. And I think you could also just honestly eat it cold. It would be one of those things that you sneak into the fridge later and like eat it cold out of the fridge because it's just delicious all on its own. And I loved your idea for Parmesan cheese in it. I think that would be really tasty. I'm sure there's tons of ways you could do it. Really good. A nice different kind of side to your dinner.
I like the variation in a starch because sometimes I feel like the starch is on the side because that's what the kids want. They want noodles or they want
Potatoes or
rice
yeah.
or potatoes. Like that's kind of the three solid ones. And this one I think I could put into rotation easily.
I agree. It's a nice change. Feels fancy. Like if
Right?
you were having people over, I think if you made the polenta, like make it the day before and then warm it up.
You could make these as like an appetizer and cut them into like little single serving squares with that relish on it.
Yes. Yum.
Hosting ideas.
Holiday parties coming up. If you have to bring something, Erin's got the recipe for you.
And it's gluten free.
Perfect.
So there you go.
And I can attest that using the sour cream was perfectly fine on my lactose sensitive digestive system.
Yay!
I had no problems with it. I would not have known that there was any dairy in it.
Excellent. And then the corn dessert that I made, this sweet corn mochi, and that was with the fresh corn from my garden. So after I harvested my corn off,
You shucked it? Did you?
is that what shucking is?
Shucking the corn, yes.
Is that taking off
Taking off all that outside stuff.
Oh, okay.
This is like something to note. It's something of note that
Okay.
you shucked your very own corn that you grew in your own backyard.
In a small backyard
easy to
space, it's
do.
not really something that you always get. So
Yeah, I think it's
fun
exciting.
times.
Mhm.
All right. So after that, you just take a knife and run it kind of top to bottom along your cobs and cut off those corn kernels. This recommended 2 to 3 cobs. So those are like store size ones that you want to make 2.5 cups of fresh corn. And so I tossed that in my Ninja blender with half a cup of coconut milk, blended that up until it was a very smooth slurry. And then to those wet ingredients in the blender, I added 2 eggs, 3/4 of a cup of sugar, a 1/4 cup of melted butter, half a teaspoon of vanilla, and half a teaspoon of salt. And then popped it back onto the blender again and really let it run until everything was well mixed and blended. Then you're going to take that liquid and pour it into a bowl. Or if your blender is bigger, you can add your flour and baking powder to your blender. But I was topped out once I had all my wet ingredients in there. So I just put that into a mixing bowl and added in 2 cups of this glutinous rice flour and a teaspoon of baking powder. And so just kind of whisked that in until I got a really smooth batter. So this is completely different than the polenta batter in that you want it to be thin like pancake or crepe batter almost. It's a very thin batter. And then you pour this into an 8x8 baking dish that I lined with parchment paper because I never trust that these things are going to release if I just grease it. I have no faith. And then it bakes in a 350 oven for an hour. So this was quick and easy. And when it is done, pop it out, let it cool, cut it into squares, and eat it.
Enjoy. Yeah.
And hopefully you enjoy it. It is a corn sweet cake that's chewy.
It is definitely chewy. That is how I would describe the texture, and it's not in a bad way. I actually really liked this. I wasn't sure what to expect after I think we talked about earlier, the Chinese New Year cake, which was such a different texture with that rice flour and starch, like it was quite gummy. This was more cake, more like what I would think a cake would be. Definitely kind of like sticks in your teeth a little bit, but I didn't mind. The flavor of this is like hit you in the face, fresh corn. I love that.
It is really corn forward.
Yeah, I was like, wow, this is like, it is a little bit sweet, but not overly. And it's just this really fresh flavor of corn, which I love that.
Yeah, I kind of thought this was great. It was like the cake version of the corn juice box drink that we had earlier
That's right.
in the year. Like it really did have that like sweet cream corn, like that flavor in it. And I really liked with the coconut milk too. Like I think this is a win.
This is a win. And it's interesting because it's one of those types of things you're not sure how this will be a dessert. Like, is corn the flavor for a dessert? I don't know how that's going to go. If you're thinking that too, you will probably be pleasantly surprised, as we were. My whole family was like, at first like, oh, interesting. And then, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I like this. Like at first the texture kind of strikes you as odd, but then it's like, no, I like it. This is,
Yeah.
I'm liking this. Yeah.
It's one of those things that you have to like wrap your brain around as you're eating it, because you're like, do I like
Corn.
this? This is very corn-like, really chewy, but then you just keep taking more bites.
And you can't stop yourself. And you
Yeah.
realize that you've eaten like a whole piece and it's gone and you actually really loved it.
Mhm.
It sneaks up on you.
If you don't like the corn in this, I'm going to hazard that you could make this pumpkin flavored mochi. You could make this like ube mochi. You could make this with yams. I think you could put anything that has a good, strong flavor that's thicker and more substantial, like corn is, like something like these root veggies I'm talking. I think you could do that and make the same sort of.
I think it would have to be a sweeter profile, like you said, like a yam, or I like this pumpkin idea. Should I try it with my pureed pumpkin that I've got in the freezer?
Or maybe, yeah, maybe.
With some pumpkin spice in there?
Yeah, put all the pumpkin spices.
I'm loving this idea.
So I think you could do it with mango if you wanted to go sweet. I'm trying to think of what types of mochis there are. Like I've had an ube mochi before, so I'm thinking anything else that has that sort of texture totally would work.
I love this idea.
So.
And it's just slightly different. And I like that it holds up in a nice little square.
Yeah.
When you cut them up, they're not messy or not going to crumble or fall apart. Like it's a texture that makes a nice little square. And so if you want to serve those,
it's packable,
or put it out on a buffet or whatever. Yeah, you could put them in lunch boxes. You could throw them in a little container and pop it in your bag for when you're out when I'm out at fencing class tonight. It'd be great to have that as a little snack. I love it. Where has mochi been all my life? I don't think I've ever eaten one before.
I think I have officially found a gluten-free dessert that is like something I would make again and again, right? And that you can change up and add to, and the same way that like we like to make pies or tarts or whatever, this is that thing that you can kind of change up seasonally and add to and have this solid gluten-free dessert that when you get together with people, everyone's going to want to eat this. You don't have to be like, oh, this is the gluten-free dessert only. Like, make mochis and you're done.
It's something different and everyone's going to be like, oh, I want to try.
Fantastic. Yay.
Yay, corn.
Corn is the coolest. In case anyone missed the first half. Corn is the coolest. Excellent. I'm really glad that we went down that you came down this rabbit hole with me, and we could kind of explore the world of corn in a sweet and a savory recipe.
Both winners, both of them I want to make.
And now for the fine print. Join us over on the socials. Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on our website at threekitchenspodcast.com. Remember, when you like, follow, subscribe, and leave us a review, it helps more people find us. Thank you so much for listening.
I think you might have called yourself a corn nerd.
I'll take the title.
Nice.